In the heart of Chicago, there stood a courthouse that buzzed with activity every day. People from all walks of life, lawyers in sharp suits, defendants clutching files, and families hoping for justice, filled its halls. But one figure loomed over the building like a dark cloud: Judge Richard Holloway. Known for his sharp tongue and even sharper temper, Holloway had earned a reputation as someone who didn't tolerate nonsense, or so he claimed. In reality, many whispered that he was biased, arrogant, and often unfair, especially when it came to cases involving people of color or those struggling financially. Holloway had once been a prosecutor, climbing the ranks quickly thanks to his family's connections and his knack for winning high-profile cases. When he became a judge, he carried that same air of superiority into the courtroom. He would often interrupt lawyers mid-sentence, dismiss arguments without hearing them fully, and make snide remarks under the guise of keeping order. Those who dared to challenge him were met with icy stares and thinly veiled threats. Over time, fewer people spoke up, fearing retaliation or unfavorable rulings. It seemed like no one could hold him accountable. On this particular morning, the courthouse was busier than usual. The docket included a civil case between Maya Thompson, a determined single mother and community advocate, and her landlord, who stood accused of neglecting repairs and discriminating against tenants. Maya had spent weeks preparing for this day. She gathered evidence, photos of moldy walls, broken heaters, and pest-infested corners, and reached out to neighbors who faced similar issues. Her goal wasn't just to win her case. She wanted to expose the landlord's pattern of mistreatment and inspire change in her neighborhood. As Maya waited nervously outside the courtroom, she couldn't help but notice the tension in the air. People exchanged wary glances, and some avoided sitting too close to others, as if anticipating trouble. When her name was called, she took a deep breath and stepped inside. The room was packed, not only with lawyers and court staff, but also with friends and supporters from her community. They had come to show solidarity, knowing how important this case was for everyone living in substandard conditions. Judge Holloway sat at the front, his expression unreadable behind thick-rimmed glasses. As the proceedings began, Maya introduced herself confidently, explaining her situation and presenting her evidence. She spoke clearly and passionately, her voice steady despite her nerves. But as she continued, Judge Holloway's demeanor shifted. At first, he tapped his pen impatiently, then sighed loudly, and finally leaned back in his chair with an exaggerated look of boredom. It was clear he wasn't interested in what she had to say. The gallery watched silently, sensing the growing hostility. Maya pressed on, refusing to let intimidation silence her. Yet, something about the judge's behavior hinted at what was coming next, a moment that would shock everyone present and ignite a firestorm far beyond the walls of the courthouse. Maya Thompson stood tall as she took the witness stand, her hands gripping the edge of the wooden railing. The courtroom fell silent, all eyes fixed on her. She wore a simple yet polished outfit, a navy blue blazer over a white blouse, and her hair was neatly tied back in a bun. Despite the nerves fluttering in her chest, Maya exuded calmness and determination. This wasn't just about her. It was about every tenant who had been ignored, dismissed, or mistreated by landlords who thought they could get away with cutting corners. With a steady voice, Maya began to recount her story. She explained how she moved into the apartment 3 years ago, hoping for a safe place to raise her 2 young children. At first, things seemed fine, but soon problems started piling up. The heating system broke down during one of Chicago's coldest winters, leaving her family shivering through nights wrapped in blankets. Then came the leaks, water dripping from the ceiling whenever it rained, forming dark patches of mold on the walls. When she reported these issues to her landlord, he brushed her off, saying repairs would be made eventually. But eventually never came. Maya didn't stop there. She pulled out a folder filled with evidence, photographs showing cracks in the walls, rusted pipes, and cockroaches scurrying across the kitchen floor. Each picture told a story of neglect and frustration. She also shared copies of emails and letters she had sent to the landlord, pleading for help. Her tone remained respectful but firm as she emphasized that she always paid her rent on time, despite the deplorable conditions. "I work hard," she said, looking directly at Judge Holloway. "I deserve better than this." Her words struck a chord with those watching. In the gallery, neighbors nodded in agreement, some whispering encouragement under their breath. One woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, recalling her own struggles with similar issues. Even the court clerk paused typing mid-sentence, clearly moved by Maya's testimony. For a moment, it felt like the room was united in solidarity, a collective acknowledgement of the injustice Maya faced. But Judge Holloway wasn't swayed. As Maya spoke, his expression grew increasingly irritated. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his brow furrowed deeper with each passing minute. When she mentioned how the landlord had ignored her complaints because she was black, the judge let out an audible sigh. His impatience was palpable now, his pen tapping rhythmically against the desk. It was almost as if he couldn't wait for her to finish, so he could move on to something more interesting, or less inconvenient. Finally, Maya concluded her statement by urging the court to hold the landlord accountable. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice rising slightly with emotion. "It's about fairness. Everyone deserves a safe home, regardless of their race or income." The gallery erupted in quiet murmurs of approval, though they quickly hushed when the judge shot them a sharp glare. For a brief moment, Maya allowed herself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, someone in power would listen this time. But as Judge Holloway leaned forward, his lips curling into a sneer, that hope began to waver. Something inside him snapped, and what happened next would leave everyone reeling. Not just in the courtroom, but across the entire city. Within minutes of leaving the courthouse, Maya's friend uploaded the video clip to social media. It wasn't long before the footage began spreading like wildfire. The clip captured Judge Holloway's dismissive tone and cutting remarks in stark detail, leaving viewers stunned and outraged. Social media users couldn't believe what they were seeing. A judge, someone entrusted with upholding justice, behaving in such a disrespectful and prejudiced manner. Comments flooded in from all corners of the internet, calling for accountability and justice. The hashtags #JusticeForMaya and #RemoveHolloway quickly gained traction, trending not just locally but nationally. People shared their own stories of mistreatment in courtrooms, amplifying Maya's voice and turning her individual case into a broader movement. Journalists picked up on the story almost immediately, recognizing its potential to spark meaningful conversations about systemic bias within the legal system. News outlets aired segments during primetime broadcasts, replaying the viral video alongside interviews with experts who condemned Judge Holloway's behavior as unprofessional and unacceptable. As the hours passed, protests began forming outside the courthouse. Dozens of people gathered at first, holding signs that read "Fair Courts for All" and "No More Bias." By evening, the crowd had grown to hundreds, spilling onto the streets surrounding the building. Community leaders took turns addressing the demonstrators, urging them to stay peaceful while demanding change. Maya herself joined the protests later that day, flanked by friends and supporters who cheered when she stepped onto an impromptu stage to speak. "I didn't ask for this," Maya admitted, her voice trembling slightly as she addressed the crowd. "All I wanted was for my landlord to fix the problems in my apartment. But what happened today isn't just about me. It's about every person who has ever felt powerless in front of someone like Judge Holloway." Her words resonated deeply, earning thunderous applause. Many in the audience wiped away tears, moved by her courage and determination to keep fighting despite everything she had endured. Meanwhile, civil rights organizations seized the opportunity to amplify the issue further. Prominent groups issued statements condemning Judge Holloway's conduct and calling for an investigation into his past rulings. Lawyers from across the country volunteered their services, offering to represent Maya pro bono if needed. Even celebrities weighed in, using their platforms to share the story and rally support for reform. The momentum was undeniable. What started as one woman's fight for justice had transformed into a national call for accountability. Back inside the courthouse, tensions simmered among staff members. Court clerks whispered nervously about whether they might lose their jobs amid the scandal. Some judges expressed discomfort over being associated with Holloway, while others remained tight-lipped, unwilling to comment publicly. Behind closed doors, senior officials scrambled to address the growing backlash, knowing that public trust in the judicial system was hanging by a thread. By nightfall, the pressure had reached a fever pitch. Calls for Judge Holloway's removal echoed everywhere, from news headlines to social media posts to chants outside the courthouse. What made the situation even more explosive was the mounting evidence against him. As people dug deeper into his career, old cases resurfaced, revealing patterns of bias and misconduct that went far beyond Maya's hearing. Each new revelation fueled the fire, making it clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger problem. Still oblivious to the full extent of the storm brewing around him, Judge Holloway returned home that evening, likely assuming the day's events would blow over as they always had. But this time was different. This time, the world was watching and waiting to see how justice would respond. As Maya finished her heartfelt testimony, there was a brief pause in the courtroom. The air felt heavy, charged with emotion. Her words had painted a vivid picture of neglect and discrimination, leaving many in the gallery visibly moved. Some nodded in agreement, while others exchanged knowing glances, silently acknowledging that her struggles were not unique. For a moment, it seemed as though justice might finally take notice. But Judge Holloway's reaction quickly shattered that fragile hope. Before Maya could step down from the stand, Judge Holloway leaned forward, his face twisted into an expression of barely concealed disdain. "Enough of this nonsense," he barked, cutting through the stillness of the room like a knife. His voice was sharp and dismissive, carrying an undertone of irritation that made everyone flinch. "You people always play the victim card," he continued, his tone dripping with condescension. "If you spent less time complaining and more time working, maybe you wouldn't be in this situation." The courtroom froze. Time seemed to stop as gasps rippled through the gallery. Maya stood motionless, her eyes wide with disbelief. She opened her mouth to respond, but found herself at a loss for words. How could she defend herself against such blatant disrespect? Her lawyer immediately rose to object, slamming his hands on the table. "Your Honor, that remark is completely inappropriate and prejudiced," he exclaimed, his voice rising with indignation. But Judge Holloway waved him off dismissively, as if swatting away an annoying fly. In the audience, whispers erupted. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some shaking their heads in disbelief while others clenched their fists in anger. One woman muttered loudly enough for those around her to hear, "This isn't justice, it's bullying." Nearby, a young man pulled out his phone, capturing the scene unfolding before him. He wasn't the only one recording. Another person, a freelance journalist who happened to be sitting near the front, was filming everything discreetly. Neither of them realized how significant those recordings would become in just a matter of hours. Judge Holloway, oblivious to the growing unrest, pressed on. "Let's move on," he said curtly, turning his attention to the landlord's attorney as if nothing unusual had occurred. But the damage was done. Maya slowly stepped down from the stand, her cheeks flushed with a mix of embarrassment and anger. As she returned to her seat beside her lawyer, she whispered, "I can't believe this is happening." Her lawyer placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, but even he looked shaken by what had transpired. Outside the courthouse, tension simmered. Friends and supporters gathered, discussing what they had witnessed. Someone shared the video clips online, sparking immediate outrage. Social media platforms lit up with posts condemning Judge Holloway's behavior. Comments poured in from across the city. And soon, the country, as people expressed their shock and fury over his remarks. Hashtags like #JusticeForMaya began trending, drawing attention to not only this specific incident, but also years of complaints about Holloway's conduct in court. Back inside, the proceedings continued, though no one seemed focused anymore. Lawyers glanced nervously at each other, unsure how to proceed after such a volatile exchange. In the gallery, several attendees quietly excused themselves, unable to stomach the atmosphere any longer. Meanwhile, Maya sat silently, staring straight ahead, her mind racing. She hadn't expected this kind of treatment when she walked into the courthouse that morning, but now something within her stirred, a determination to fight back, no matter what it took. What started as a routine hearing had turned into something far bigger than anyone could have imagined. And little did Judge Holloway know, his careless words were about to set off a chain reaction that would change everything for Maya, for the community, and most importantly, for himself. Months after Judge Holloway's arrest and conviction, the ripple effects of Maya's courage continued to spread far and wide. The courthouse where it all began became a symbol of both accountability and hope. In the wake of the scandal, sweeping reforms were implemented across the judicial system in Chicago. Judges underwent mandatory training on bias and ethics, while new oversight committees were formed to handle complaints about misconduct. For many, these changes signaled a turning point, a shift toward fairness and transparency in a system that had long seemed untouchable. Judge Holloway's trial remained a topic of discussion for years. Documentaries, podcasts, and investigative reports dissected his downfall, examining how one man's unchecked arrogance could lead to such widespread harm. His case served as a cautionary tale, reminding those in power that trust must be earned and can easily be lost. Meanwhile, his empty chambers at the courthouse stood as a silent reminder of the consequences of corruption. Eventually, the space was repurposed into a community resource center, offering free legal clinics and workshops to help tenants understand their rights. For Maya Thompson, life took on a new purpose. Her nonprofit organization, Safe Homes, Strong Communities, flourished beyond her wildest dreams. What started as a small initiative grew into a nationwide movement, with chapters in cities across the country. Tenants who once felt powerless now had tools and support to fight back against neglectful landlords. Maya traveled extensively, speaking at conferences and rallies, sharing her story not as a victim, but as a victor. Her speeches inspired standing ovations, and her name became synonymous with resilience and justice. One of the proudest moments came when local officials unveiled a plaque outside the courthouse honoring Maya's bravery. It read, "Courage can change the world," dedicated to Maya Thompson, whose determination brought light to the shadows of injustice. On the day of the unveiling, hundreds gathered to celebrate. Friends, family, and strangers alike cheered as Maya stood before the crowd, humbled yet radiant. "This isn't my victory alone," she said, her voice strong and steady. "It belongs to every person who refused to stay silent, who believed that things could be better. Together, we proved that even the smallest voices can make the loudest impact." The landlord involved in Maya's case faced severe consequences as well. Fines and lawsuits forced him to sell several properties, and city inspectors shut down others deemed unsafe. Word spread among other landlords, prompting many to take tenant concerns more seriously. Slowly but surely, neighborhoods began to transform, not just physically with repaired buildings and cleaner streets, but socially as communities united to demand respect and dignity. Years later, Maya's children grew up hearing stories of their mother's fight, not as something distant or abstract, but as part of their family legacy. They watched her tirelessly advocate for others, teaching them the value of standing up for what's right. Her youngest daughter, inspired by her mother's example, decided to pursue a career in law, determined to continue the work of creating a fairer society. As time passed, Maya reflected on how much had changed since that fateful day in court. She thought about the fear she'd felt walking into the courtroom, unsure if anyone would listen. And she thought about the moment Judge Holloway was led away in handcuffs, a moment that ignited a chain reaction no one could have predicted. Through it all, she realized that justice wasn't just about winning a single case. It was about planting seeds of change that would grow over time. In the end, Maya's journey taught everyone an important lesson: that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they refuse to give up. Her story became a beacon of hope, proof that even in the face of overwhelming odds, courage and determination can move mountains. And though challenges still existed, Maya knew the world was inching closer to the kind of justice she had always dreamed of. One step, one voice, and one victory at a time. Just 2 days after the video of Judge Holloway's outburst went viral, a sense of unease settled over the courthouse. The once bustling hallways were quieter than usual, with court staff whispering nervously about what might happen next. Unbeknownst to Judge Holloway, warrant had been issued for his arrest, following the preliminary findings of the Judicial Inquiry Board's investigation. The board uncovered enough evidence of misconduct and abuse of power to justify immediate action, and law enforcement was instructed to bring him into custody without delay. That morning, Judge Holloway arrived at the courthouse as he always did, calm, confident, and seemingly unfazed by the chaos surrounding him. He strode through the entrance, exchanging brief nods with security guards who had long grown accustomed to his authoritative demeanor. As he made his way to his chambers, he appeared oblivious to the fact that his world was about to crumble. Inside his office, he sat down at his desk, organizing files for the day's hearings. But before he could even glance at the first document, there was a knock on the door. "Come in," he called out, expecting one of his clerks or perhaps an attorney seeking clarification on a ruling. Instead, 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, their expressions stern and professional. One of them held up a piece of paper. "Judge Richard Holloway, you are under arrest," the officer announced, his voice firm but measured. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Holloway's face turned pale as the words sank in. For a moment, he sat frozen, staring at the officers as if trying to process what was happening. Then, anger bubbled to the surface. "This is absurd," he snapped, rising from his chair. "Do you know who I am?" "This is a gross misunderstanding." But the officers remained unmoved, reciting the rest of his rights as they approached him. They carefully placed handcuffs around his wrists, ensuring the procedure was respectful yet firm. The sight of Judge Holloway being led out of his chambers sent shockwaves through the courthouse. Staff members peered cautiously from behind doors, some covering their mouths in disbelief. A few whispered prayers or muttered comments like, "It's about time." When news spread to the gallery, where Maya and her supporters had gathered for another hearing, the room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Some clapped quietly, while others simply stared, stunned by the surreal turn of events. Outside, cameras flashed as reporters captured every second of Holloway's walk of shame. His polished shoes clicked against the marble floor, now accompanied by the metallic clink of handcuffs. Gone was the air of superiority he once carried. Instead, he looked smaller, almost fragile, as he ducked into the backseat of a police car. Protesters outside cheered loudly, chanting slogans like "Justice served" and "No more corruption." Some held signs bearing images of Holloway with a red X across his face, symbolizing the end of his reign. For Maya, watching the scene unfold felt surreal. She stood among the crowd, her heart pounding with a mix of emotions: relief, vindication, and even a touch of sadness. She hadn't wished for anyone's downfall, but she knew this moment was necessary for accountability. Her lawyer placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, leaning in to say, "This is a victory not just for you, Maya, but for everyone who has ever faced injustice in that courtroom." As the police car drove away, carrying Judge Holloway to a detention center, the significance of the moment became clear. It wasn't just about one man's fall from grace. It was proof that no one, regardless of their position, was above the law. Social media exploded with reactions as people celebrated the arrest as a step toward meaningful reform. Yet, amidst the celebration, questions lingered. Would this lead to lasting change in the judicial system, or was it merely a temporary reckoning? For now, though, the courthouse and the community could breathe a little easier. Justice, it seemed, had taken its first bold step forward. And as Maya looked around at the sea of hopeful faces surrounding her, she knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, the courthouse was abuzz with an energy unlike anything it had seen before. News of Judge Holloway's remarks had spread far and wide, and the public outcry showed no signs of slowing down. Protesters lined the streets outside, their chants echoing through the halls. No justice, no peace. Inside, court officials were scrambling to contain the fallout. The Illinois Judicial Inquiry Board, tasked with overseeing judicial conduct, wasted no time launching an emergency investigation into Judge Holloway's behavior. Investigators began by reviewing the viral video, analyzing every word and gesture captured on camera. But they didn't stop there. They delved deep into Holloway's past cases, pulling records from years of hearings where defendants or plaintiffs claimed unfair treatment. What they found painted a troubling picture. There were numerous instances where Holloway had shown favoritism toward wealthy defendants, while imposing harsh penalties on low-income individuals, particularly those from minority communities. In one case, he dismissed a tenant's complaint about unsafe living conditions with a sarcastic comment, eerily similar to what he said to Maya. Another file revealed that he had repeatedly sided with landlords accused of discrimination, often without thoroughly examining the evidence presented. As the investigation unfolded, more people came forward with stories of their own encounters with Judge Holloway. A former defendant recounted how Holloway mocked her during a custody battle, insinuating she wasn't fit to raise her children because of her financial struggles. The lawyer described how Holloway openly rolled his eyes when a young black man tried to explain why he couldn't afford legal representation. These testimonies added fuel to the fire, confirming suspicions that Holloway's actions weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern. Meanwhile, Maya's case gained even more attention. Prominent civil rights organizations rallied around her, offering not only moral support, but also resources to ensure her fight continued. Legal teams volunteered to assist her pro bono, determined to overturn the landlord's injustices and set a precedent for future cases. With so much scrutiny on the situation, officials decided to reassign Maya's hearing to another judge, one known for fairness and impartiality. This decision brought a glimmer of hope to Maya and her supporters, who felt vindicated after days of turmoil. Outside the courthouse, the protests grew larger and louder. People traveled from neighboring cities to join the demonstrations, holding banners that read, "Judges must be fair," and "Enough is enough." Community leaders used megaphones to address the crowd, emphasizing the importance of standing together against systemic bias. Local musicians performed stirring songs about resilience and justice, turning the protest into a powerful display of unity. Even passers-by stopped to listen, some joining in spontaneously as the message resonated with them. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense. Judges exchanged uneasy glances, aware that all eyes were now on the judiciary system. Some expressed frustration with Holloway, believing his actions reflected poorly on the entire profession. Others quietly admitted that his behavior had long been a source of concern, but went unaddressed due to fear of backlash. Now, with the weight of public opinion bearing down, there was no room for silence or complacency. By the end of the week, the pressure reached a tipping point. Calls for accountability came from every direction. Lawmakers demanded answers, advocacy groups filed formal complaints, and citizens signed petitions urging swift action. The Illinois Judicial Inquiry Board announced that it would expedite its investigation, promising transparency and thoroughness. It became clear that Judge Holloway's career, and possibly his freedom, was hanging by a thread. For Maya, the whirlwind of events was overwhelming yet empowering. She never imagined her quest for justice would spark such widespread change. As she stood among the protesters, holding hands with strangers turned allies, she realized something profound. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It belonged to everyone who believed in fairness, equality, and the power of collective action. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, one thing was undeniable. The world was finally listening. With Judge Holloway removed from the bench and awaiting trial, Maya's case was reassigned to Judge Laura Mendez, a respected figure known for her fairness and dedication to upholding the law. Unlike Holloway, Judge Mendez approached every case with patience and an open mind, ensuring that all parties had a chance to present their arguments fully. When Maya entered the courtroom for the new hearing, she felt a sense of calm she hadn't experienced before. The atmosphere was different, less tense, more respectful, and it gave her hope that justice might finally prevail. The proceedings began smoothly, with both sides presenting their cases clearly and thoroughly. Maya's lawyer laid out the evidence once again. Photos of the hazardous living conditions, emails documenting her repeated requests for repairs, and testimonies from neighbors who faced similar neglect. This time, however, the judge listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and taking detailed notes. When the landlord's attorney tried to downplay the issues or shift blame onto Maya, Judge Mendez interrupted firmly but politely. "Let's stick to the facts," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. As the day wore on, Maya found herself feeling empowered rather than intimidated. She spoke confidently when called to testify, explaining how the poor conditions affected not only her but also her children. Her voice trembled slightly when she described nights spent huddled under blankets during power outages, but her determination never wavered. By the end of her testimony, even some of the court staff were visibly moved, nodding in agreement as she emphasized the importance of safe housing for families like hers. When closing arguments concluded, Judge Mendez didn't hesitate. After a brief recess to review the evidence, she returned with a ruling that sent waves of relief through the gallery. "Based on the information presented today," she announced, her voice steady and authoritative, "it is clear that the landlord failed to meet basic obligations to provide a safe and habitable living environment. Ms. Thompson is entitled to compensation for damages and the cost of temporary housing while repairs are made. Furthermore, I am ordering an inspection by city officials to ensure compliance moving forward." The gallery erupted in applause, with many people rising to their feet. Maya covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her face as supporters hugged her tightly. For the first time in months, or perhaps years, she felt seen and heard. Outside the courthouse, news crews captured the emotional moment, broadcasting clips of Maya thanking her lawyers, friends, and community members who had stood by her side. "This victory isn't just mine," she told reporters gathered at the steps. "It belongs to everyone who has ever been silenced or ignored. We deserve better, and we won't stop fighting until things change." But Maya didn't stop there. Inspired by the overwhelming support she received, she decided to turn her experience into action. With help from civil rights organizations, she founded a nonprofit group called Safe Homes, Strong Communities. The organization aimed to educate tenants about their rights, advocate for stricter housing regulations, and hold negligent landlords accountable. Maya traveled across the city, speaking at town halls and community meetings, sharing her story to inspire others to speak up. Her efforts quickly gained traction. Local lawmakers took notice, introducing legislation to strengthen tenant protections and increase penalties for landlords who violated housing codes. Maya testified before committees, urging them to prioritize affordable and safe housing for all. Her courage and persistence earned her recognition far beyond Chicago. National media outlets featured her work, highlighting how one woman's fight had sparked meaningful reform. Meanwhile, Judge Holloway's trial dominated headlines for weeks. Evidence presented during the proceedings painted a damning picture of his career, revealing years of unethical behavior and bias. Witnesses recounted stories of mistreatment, and experts criticized his rulings as inconsistent and prejudiced. In the end, he was found guilty of multiple counts of misconduct, stripped of his judicial license, and sentenced to prison. The verdict served as a powerful reminder that accountability could reach even those in positions of power. For Maya, the journey wasn't easy, but it was worth it. She had started as a single mother simply trying to protect her family, and along the way, she became a symbol of resilience and justice. Her story inspired countless others to stand up against inequality, proving that one voice could ignite a movement. As she looked back on everything she'd been through, Maya knew this was just the beginning. A stepping stone toward creating a world where fairness wasn't the exception, but the rule.